Hello, everyone. This is John with the Race Class Podcast, and we are doing something new. In addition to our monthly episodes with Arnie that first appear on her show, I, this fall, got really fortunate and had the opportunity to do some side conversations with scholars who study race and racism from different perspectives, many of whom have recently written books that you should read. And so today's episode is with Professor Laura Chavez-Moreno, who is in the Department of Chicano and Central American Studies and Education at UCLA, and has a new, really exciting book about called How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America, that we're going to be diving into. And so I'm just really excited for this. And let me just start by welcoming you, Laura, Professor Chavez-Moreno, to the Race Class Podcast. Before we get into anything, can you just tell me how people can get a hold of your book?
Thanks for inviting me, John, and thanks for the question. People can find the book at any major booksellers, including Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, and the Harvard Education Press, which is the press that published the book. And I'd also encourage listeners to ask their public library or local bookstore to carry the book.
Yeah, definitely. Get it into your local library, get it into your local bookstore. Are you doing book talks? Are you on a tour?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So also tell your local bookstore to call Professor Chavez-Moreno to bring her down for a book talk. Great. Well, thank you so much for being with me, for taking the time. It is a really hard moment right now, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States. I spent a decade in LA, and just talking with many friends who are still there, the experience in LA has been quite brutal, particularly since June when there was an initial just huge ICE surge. And so I want to start, Laura, by just asking you how you're doing. And you can answer however you want to. I don't mean it in that just passing us in the hallway sense, where we just sort of reflexively say, "How you doing?" and then remember that, oh yeah, we're in this moment where that's a very sort of heavy question. But I like earnestly will ask, though. Again, I invite you to respond however you want. How are you doing? It is hard to overstate the challenges of the moment, and I think for many of us, including educators who simply want to speak honestly with students about race and racism. So, how are you doing?
Thanks for the question. And yes, it is very, very challenging. And it's challenging for teachers in K to 12 classrooms, and it's also challenging for university professors like myself, although obviously to different degrees. But it's also challenging to be in LA. Like you mentioned, you referenced the abduction and disappearances of folks from our streets. What I try to always remember is that to look for community and to not feel alone. So I do, even though it has been very challenging and very difficult, it is I constantly remind myself to be in community with others. So I've been able to do that and still have some places where I find folks who I can resist with, and then also other folks who I could find joy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's, on a probably a minuscule scale relative to LA, but the neighborhood where I live in East Somerville, just outside of Boston in Massachusetts, we've been experiencing our own surge recently with abductions and kidnappings. And so I personally, for the first time, have witnessed a couple And it is, yeah, it's really hard to capture and really understand just the feeling. Um, so you've sort of experienced this. So yeah, just really appreciate you being with us in this moment. So something that I always love to ask guests on this show, in part because it's something that I think about a lot, is where was your racial education? And I mean the question in a sort of somewhat amorphous way, um, but I think that there's ways in which all of us, either explicitly or implicitly, sort of learn about race in uh, in the United States, and I'm just curious sort of where that occurred, how that occurred. And so I'll just ask you, where was your racial education? What did it look like?
It's interesting because I there's different ways that I've experienced this depending on where I was. And in I remember very clearly when I was here as an immigrant student in the US, noticing the disparities in terms of how different groups were treated, and that informing my sense of just how schools were sometimes unfair for at the time I didn't know, but racial reasons, right? So I went to school in Douglas, Arizona, and the majority of the students there are Mexican/Mexican American. But the students who were like in honors classes were those classes were predominantly white students in the classes. So things like that. Also, I was in different like extracurricular activities and competing or meeting up with other schools. I also noticed that my school was very, very under-resourced compared to other schools. And those other schools that had more resources were predominantly white compared to ours, for example. So those type of situations I noticed very early on. But then as you know, undergrad, I also went to Arizona while Arizona was banning bilingual education. So that was something also that really informed my idea of what racism could look against Latinx students. So different periods of my life have had different, I guess, racial awakenings, if I could perhaps put it
Yeah,
that way.
yeah. Thank you. No, and those sorts of movements to ban bilingual education or to codify English as the quote unquote American language is something that we've seen really hit the national stage through the Trump administration as it really endeavors to limit both resources for and opportunities for any sort of non-English education, which is concerning for the reasons you said and others. And all sort of is a nice segue into the next question that I want to ask, and I assume there's some connection there. But I'm always curious how well accomplished academics like you end up there, and so I'm really curious if you could tell us a little bit about your professional journey. How'd you end up where you are? Were there pivotal moments along the way, or was this just predestined from the start?
Definitely not predestined. So, and you're right that kind of pivots us. My last answer pivots as well to this to answering this question because my professional journey began when I think of it when I was deciding as an undergrad whether I was going to be a history teacher or a Spanish teacher. In high school, I decided that I was going to go into teaching, but in undergrad, I was still deciding between those two subjects. And when Arizona banned bilingual education, that's where I decided that kind of like the signature issue for the Latinx community was language. So that's why I chose to become a teacher of Spanish. So, in terms of how I got to from there to this point, though, which is very different in terms of being a university professor, it was something that I never imagined that I was going to be. I never imagined that I would be a book author. I never imagined that I would be a writer as a profession because as a university professor at UCLA, that's really most of my job is writing and publishing. Um, but I got here. I guess I got to this type of profession because I have a lot of questions. And the writing process helps me think through those questions for me and hopefully in conversation with other folks. So that's how I got to this part of it. I enjoy teaching a lot also because teaching also helps me process the type of questions that I have with others uh, like in person instead of writing where you're, toiling at something and then hopefully someone reads it, etc. So, but the teaching in the university also helps me process and think with others and learn with others. So I enjoy that aspect of it. And and when I was a high school teacher, I enjoyed the teaching part, but I didn't have that type of space to reflect and think through things that I would have liked to.
Yeah, all of that really resonates. And so I was going to respond, but I guess I'm curious, are your students mostly undergraduate students? Are you also teaching graduate students? And what are the classes that you tend to teach?
Sure, I kind of teach a combination half and half. So the type of classes that I teach for undergrads, I just finished last year teaching a critical race theory course,
Oh,
critical race theory
cool.
in education for undergrads. That was my first time teaching that course. And then the same quarter, we're in the quarter system at UCLA. In the same
Yeah.
quarter, I taught a CRT class, but a version for graduate students in that class, that I've taught that before. Other classes that I teach is, for example, I teach a course for undergrads called Latinx's and Public Education, and we look at how it is that here in this so-called democracy in the U.S., why are there racial inequities in education, and what could we do about that? I'm going to be teaching my department's qualitative intro class for graduate students. So I usually have half and half of the load. I've also taught a graduate course on racialization, for what that means in terms of the Latinx group. So it varies. I've taught another undergrad class about Latinx literacies, I called it. So that was a fun experience for me also.
Man, I have so many questions about what's actually going on in each of these classes. I'm going to have to get my hands on the syllabi. But something that I think so I teach law students. And so it's not undergrads, but one thing that I my sense is my students often underappreciate is the degree to which our engagement in class benefits me. Because I think that there is some, just sensibility that because I happen to be the professor, I just know quote unquote answers and I'm there to maybe provide them. But there really is often a nice dynamic of working through, you know, just questions with students who, they occupy a different position in the classroom. But especially for me, these are, full grown adults who are really thoughtful, sophisticated thinkers. And one instance when I really benefited from it was in a class that I was teaching a few years ago that was a CRT-like seminar, but it was formally titled Problems in Anti-Discrimination Law, that we were really trying to interrogate why it is that anti-discrimination law now actually makes it hard to remedy discrimination. And those students, it was a space where I was able to think through um, just how to understand some of the early sort of efforts in the anti-critical race theory hysteria that began to brew in like 2021. But so let me now shift to the book. And I think a number of things that you mentioned, I want to tease out, and I want to start by asking you to help us think through some language a little bit. And so in a second, actually, I'm going to ask how you think about, the term Latin X or Latin X relative to Latine or just language and vocabulary used for a particular group and um, what informs the terms you use. I'm also really curious if you could sort of just tell us, what you mean by the term racialization and Latinidad. But first, um, in the preface of your book, you note that the project that you are exploring, that you're recounting, examines how schooling makes race. And you talk about schooling as a racial project. As a scholar of race and racism, that just sings to me because it is, yeah, for reasons that I guess, like it sings. But I do think that it's, so, different than how we just tend to, the words that we even tend to use when talking about race. And so I'm just wondering if you could um, share what you mean when you say schooling makes race or the term racial project for someone who's listening and they're like, what does that mean?
Thank you. I'm great the way that you phrased this question. It's great the way you phrased it because when you're saying about how we talk about race, for example, a lot of the times people throw out the phrase race is socially constructed. And my answer to all the three questions you asked in terms of like what is Latinx versus Latine, what is racialization, what do I mean by schooling makes race, it all has to do with trying to remind us of what that or say what that means in terms of what I feel it means. The race is socially constructed, and what that means is I want to emphasize that it is not an illusion. Race is not something that doesn't have consequence in our lives or that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist biologically, but it does exist in terms of how it matters. And I've heard you say in the podcast, race matters, and definitely matters. And but then what is it? What is race? And one of the things that I'm trying to show in the book is that race is not something that's just the identity of a person or even of a group. It is something that the society is continuously practicing or continue through its practices. It is continually reinforcing and constructing the boundaries and delimiting what is one group versus another, for example, through its racist practices. So when we're thinking about race, we have to think about it. It's not just something that a person is born with, it is something that society is creating. That's what it means when we're saying socially constructed. Society is creating the racialized groups. And schooling, because it is such an important institution in our society, schooling has a major part in this construction and the reinforcing of racial ideas. Sometimes schooling can take a stance of being anti-racist and show kids like, no, we shouldn't treat others based on, their looks, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the time, schooling reinforces the status quo. That is, that racism exists and that there is a hierarchy to racialized groups.
Great. Yeah, and in a moment, I'm just going to invite you to sort of help us dig into each of the sort of main parts of your book and sort of like a little um, 101. But I do just there was early on in the book there is you sort of call out the phrase race is the social construct and the ease with which we name that, we say it, but then we fall back into a practice of actually treating race not as something that's socially constructed, but as something that happens to pre-exist, society and culture, and it's just something that we have. And you talk a little bit about language that you use, and I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit more about how you think, like, just like, and I guess I'm also, yeah. So I'd love just to hear you share about how you are mindful about the language you use to talk about race so as not to um, entrench this idea that race is biological. And then whether you always use that language or if the way you talk about race in class is different than the way you talk about race, at the restaurant or the coffee shop. And yeah, just really curious how you think about language because the way that you talk about it in the book, it does reveal just a level of thoughtfulness that you don't that one doesn't always get, even reading stuff from folks who are really interested in remedying historical contemporary inequalities. Um, and yeah, so I should cut myself off. But yeah, how do you think about, different ways to just the language that you use to talk about race in ways that does not sort of reinforce the notion that race is biological?
Thank you. One of the things that I'm very grateful for you to say that. So thank you because uh, language is something that's very important for me. So in terms of thinking about what ideas are being conveyed. So I'm very glad to hear that you felt that resonated with you. One of the things that I feel was, or one of the things that I do for listeners who haven't read the book is I use instead of saying race, I try to use the word, for example, racialized group. And the reason I like racialized, for example, or racialization is because those words point to a process. And the book is trying to show this process for folks so that we can understand how this process is being done in society right now, not just in the past, for example. Because when we're thinking about it right now, then we can really more clearly see some of the decisions that are being made right now that reinforce racial ideas and reinforce the idea that these groups exist and reinforce racist practices oftentimes. So this is why I use those terms because they point to the process instead of just like something that we have. For example, when we use the word race, sometimes we say it like, for example, oh, his or their race is this or something like that. So I think that that type of language reinforces the idea that there is this innate identity of a person. I also, in terms of the language again, I'd like to go back to the other question that you asked in terms of why do I use Latinx
Oh
versus
yeah,
Latine?
yeah.
And thanks for asking this question also because a lot of folks uh, think have a preference for one or the other, and I definitely do for me. So I use Latinx with an X for four reasons. One is to challenge patriarchy, which Latina, for example, also does. Another one is because it was a gift from the trans and queer community in order for us to trouble gender binaries. A third reason is I use the X to remind us that Latinx is a particular social group in the US that is different from the idea of Latin American. So I don't synonymize those. I think Latin American is different than Latinx because each context has its own racial groups. And in some contexts, this race is not significant or not as significant as other places. So, for example, in Latin American countries, there isn't the equivalent of, for example, this Latinx group that we have here in the U.S. It's not that the all Latin Americans are Latinx, and then they come here to the U.S. and they continue to be Latinxes. That's not really how racialization works. And there are some racial categories in those countries that if that person, for example, say someone in Guatemala, they are what's called Ladino, which is a racial category in Guatemala. It's with a D, Ladino. If they were to come to the US and they said like, oh, I'm Ladino, that is really unintelligible here. We don't understand that. And the reason we don't understand that is because we don't distribute resources to that group. So that's not a group that's created in society, if that makes sense.
Oh, that totally makes sense. And actually, it reminds me. So, Bob Chang is a law professor at UC Irvine now, and he wrote a piece last year on, sort of unpacking the quote unquote color blindness of the Roberts Court, the current Supreme Court. And he used the term American white in order to situate whiteness in a particular context, which I had not seen before. But there is something really almost freeing when we can find language that grounds the the term in the context, which and I was talking with my students about this last week, and we'll probably talk about it again tomorrow, how like one of the things we mean when we say that race is socially constructed is that it does change across geography and time. And so it's, yeah, like if you go from the United States to Guatemala, just the categories are going to be different. The meaning associated with the categories are going to be different. And also in the US, if you're in the Northeast and you're in the Southwest, just the categories and the ways that we think about things are going to shift. And so it can actually be sort of hard. It's like, all right, well then how do you measure this stuff? How do you talk about it? How do you think about it? And so I want to, yeah, really now shift into your book. And so before I'd asked if you wanted to give us sort of a little primer on the three parts of your book, which is teaching racialization, making Latinidad, and racialization's consequences. And I'll invite that, or I'll just invite you to, ground us in this story where you're looking at dual language programs in a particular place and how that has something to do with making a particular racial identity. But yeah, I would just love for you to, just help us land into the story you're telling and walk us through it a little bit.
Thank you. If I may, the fourth reason I use Latinx, and I'm definitely going to answer the question about the book more generally. But the fourth reason I use Latinx is I use the X as a reminder to also problematize Latin.
Mm,
So we shouldn't just problematize the gender of it or the patriarchy of it. The Latin is a European imposed term to name the whole continent. So that it should also be problematized. So the X for me is a reminder of that. Um, I view it kind of like a scratching off, and that was inspired by other professors, in fact. Uh,
sorry, I mean, it's just, every one of the reasons why these sorts of conversations, why it's just such a treat for me is because, it just sort of activates all these little sort of memory, nuggets that are just there. But I was at a conference in San Juan a couple of years ago, and there was a Puerto Rican scholar there who was, just naming the fact that like Spanish is a colonial language. And so there is, and so what does that mean when you are, so, so maybe I'll just ask this, but so I guess it's either a question to you or an invitation to sort of enter it or just to go into the book. But I had sort of been thinking about Spanish as a language that is racialized and subordinated and marginalized and targeted in the United States and understanding like movements to, reclaim it. But, then it is situated within this broader history and context that is, I don't know, is it complicated? Is it not complicated? But yeah, thank you
mhm.
for sharing. And then, just, popped off that little memory nugget.
Yeah. No, and it is definitely complicated. And this is why what I share this a lot with my students is this is why I try not to synonymize words because we need more words to describe our social reality because it is very complex. So I definitely appreciate that. And to answer the question that you had posed about the book is situated in a dual language program because this particular dual language program in the Midwest was although not explicitly said to have had an anti-racist goal, it was practicing that through it trying to provide an education to Latinx students who had been underserved by the district. So the district recognized this. The parents and the community really advocated for this bilingual education program. So it was offered in the middle school through the high school, and I observed the middle, excuse me, it was offered through in elementary through high school, and I observed it in the middle and the high school. And I chose a bilingual education program because I saw it as one of the better ways in the US to provide Latinx students a culturally relevant, linguistically relevant education. So in a way, this bilingual education program, like I wrote in the book, is an anti-racist practice that the district was engaged in. So, and I wanted to see how the teachers taught about race and talked about race with students in ways that were implicit and explicit. So, for example, the book starts off by describing a lesson in an ethnic studies course, and the teacher was talking about the differences between what is race and ethnicity, for example. And I point out in the book that although I start with that type of explicit lesson going on, a lot of the times when we're learning about race in schools, things are very implicit. So I go through the book and I start, and as the book progresses, it gets to be more. I show more of the implicit ways that race is being made, and people may be picking up on ideas about what is race, for example, as the book goes on. One of the things that I discuss in the book is that when I asked people about what was the Latinx group, was it an ethnicity and a race, and that started to become a question for me because of what I was observing in the classrooms, but then also what was the national discourse in terms of thinking of Latinx as just an ethnicity and not a racial group, a racialized group. So when I was in the field, I started asking people this question. And what I noticed from my time in the field was that the answer people gave me was that it was an ethnicity because, for example, they had shared cultural practices, they shared the language, etc. But then when I saw the practices in the classroom, there was always a caveat where, like, oh, yes, we share Spanish, but there's lots of Spanishes and they're different, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or when they would talk about culture, the teachers were very committed to making sure the students understood that there was many cultures. It wasn't just
Mm,
one. And for example, they were very conscious of it not having students understand be exposed to things that were not just Mexican American. And that was a very conscious choice because most of the students were of Mexican American heritage. So there was this contradiction in terms of how people were is saying that this is just an ethnicity, it's not a racial group, because they saw the different ways that the students in the classroom had different looks, right? They looked differently from each other. There wasn't this constant idea of what the Latinx student is supposed to look like in a way. So because the skin color was different for this group, they weren't a race, as if skin color was what determined a racial group. So that got me interested because I started doubting myself in terms of I hadn't always understood the Latinx group as a racial group. So then I started doubting my answer. Well, maybe that's not really what it is. So then I started looking at the literature, started
do
reading
you mind?
more.
I'm
Oh,
just gonna,
sure.
I just want to jump
Yeah,
in. So,
sure.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
when for like you said you started doubting yourself, like that's just such a like a wonderful thing that you like just like as as a scholar, as students, it's like so contrary to so much of the world we inhabit of the ability to be like, oh, wait, have I been thinking about this thing right? And so I just wanted to pause, just mark how like that is just like to me the sign of like the best scholar who encounters something where they're just like, have I been like thinking about and like maybe you act and so I'll let you sort of finish the story, but I just want to pause because it's just like I just want all my students to just hear that and be like, oh, so doubting's not a bad, it's like just so sorry, I'm interrupting, but please go ahead.
No, thank you. I'm glad you pointed this out because I actually felt foolish doubting. Like I felt like, okay, I had to kind of keep this hush hush in a way because I felt like, wait, I thought I was supposed to know this. I was studying a PhD and I was studying with Lori Letson Billings, who is in education, the premier critical race theorist. So it was interesting to be a student then and then feel that like, okay, maybe I'm not understanding something that's kind of fundamental, right?
Hmm.
So and as I was saying, I started reading more and I started reading outside of education, started reading more sociology, um, ethnic studies, philosophy, law scholarship. There was just a lot of more reading that I felt I needed to do in order to understand this. What was it that was race? And one of the things that I started to understand a little bit differently, I think, was to what was needed was this emphasis on the process. Because when we're not emphasizing the process, then we are thinking of race as just, for example, skin color.
Hmm.
This is one of the conclusions of the book. I'm jumping now to the end, kind of, but the conclusion of the book is that when schools are teaching about race, yes, it is important to talk about, to have students understand that discrimination is wrong, that there is structural inequities, et cetera, et cetera. That's definitely important. But what's also equally important is for students to understand that there's this racial process going on that is constructing the groups. Because when that wasn't happening, I felt that some of the students, when they were talking about when I interviewed students, they mentioned that they were very interested in learning about social justice, about race, etc. Well, all of them except one, actually, if if I'm being more scholarly. But one of them was not interested, but all the other students were. So it's interesting because then I would observe them in the classroom, and they seemed kind of bored and disengaged with the lessons. So then when I would ask students, okay, well, what's going on? What I found was that the students said, well, the lessons are very repetitive. You know, we've been hearing this like since elementary school, and they run out of lessons to teach us. And what I think in terms of race pedagogy, what we need to advance as educators is this idea that students need to also understand this idea that race is made and this process.
So I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the very few, um, I don't, I'm like hesitant to say to even put it this way, but a consequence of the current moment and of a federal government that is so transparently um, interested in reinstating a unapologetic racial hierarchy is that I think that there's ways in which it's actually easier to see the process that you're referring to. And so when you have, like, if you just think about immigration and the ways in which immigration, um, or just the border and like Americanness is being invoked and constructed through attacks on people who are understood to be, um, you know, like um, like presumptively un-American, um, and in ways that are like clearly have racial dimensions by targeting Latinx communities and individuals. That is so it's both, on the sense sort of just like surface level racial discrimination in the sense that it is disparate treatment against a particular group, and when that happens, we should be anxious about it. But it is also a process of um, constructing ideas about who is in the community and who is not, and whose like dignity we care about, and whose we don't, which is part of this process of racialization that is on hyperdrive in a particular way. And it's also a moment where you can also see how it's always contested, because this like very violent brutality coming from the federal government that on the one hand is extending refugee status to white South Africans, or South Africans who we sort of racially comprehend as white, and then trying to essentially um, banish from the country people who sort of we understand as Latino or Mexican, is itself part of the story. And this and then when Spanish language becomes a proxy for not American. It's all intertwined. And so yeah, so it's not, it is just there's ways in which the brutality makes it maybe a little, at least for me, I can almost feel it a little bit more, sort of these otherwise sort of amorphous concepts like a racial project or sort of or racialization. Um, yeah, feel free
Yes,
to.
thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I'm hoping readers take away from reading the book is exactly this, that racialization has these two aspects to creating the racial group. So one aspect is, for example, the government discriminated against them, and having this group be formed through the practice of providing them less resources. But that prompts then the other part of it, the second part, which is for that group to then look, both ways and be like, okay, well, we are kind of all being discriminated against, and then form an idea that we are in this group, right? So both the racism is reinforcing the idea that there's this racialized group, it is racializing them, but then the practice of anti-racism and then coming together to fight racism, those two things are actually creating the idea that this racialized group exists. So the bilingual education program, in providing bilingual education to students and being kind of an anti-racist practice, that is also fostering the idea that there is this racialized group. So both of these practices are engaging in this work, which is what the book is trying to show, is that it is very complicated in our society because it is going both ways in reinforcing the idea that racialized groups exist
And
and that they matter, right?
yeah, and so we only have a few minutes left, but one thing that I just want to sort of, I guess, invite you to respond to, but just also name is that the book, like, on the one hand, it is just this really nice entry into this research that you were doing in a particular place, but there's also a lot of like you, I think, providing really helpful insight to the reader in different sorts of ways, and including just the ways in which sort of standard language that we use is, I'll say I guess the word that I'll use to describe it is that it's racialized in ways that we don't appreciate. And so you just sort of contrast English language learner from who is someone who might be wholly fluent in one language and learning another language with someone who is fluent in English but knows no Spanish, but is positioned as like the English language learner is sort of positioned as somehow deficient, and the monolingual English speaker, they're totally proficient. And in the context of a classroom where English is the language that's being taught, there's something to that. But if you're going to abstract it out, it's like, all right, well, what are the full language skills of these students? It's really obscuring that in ways that have racial dimensions to it. And reading that made me think of a Supreme Court decision that I just assigned to my education law class, in which the Supreme Court is describing it's a how segregated Detroit is. And when the Supreme Court says Detroit's segregated, really what the Supreme Court is saying is that Detroit has a predominantly black population at the time that it is talking about. But the Supreme Court does not describe the white suburbs as segregated, even though the white suburbs are just as racially homogenous as Detroit is. And but then it's sort of like the ways in which certain terms that are sort of like Q race are attached to certain racialized groups, but not to other racialized groups.
Hmm, hmm. Yes, this is interesting because it's also pointing to how we're seeing what the problem is, right? The problem is in that they are wanting to be alone or like apart, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that, like you mentioned before, language is really important for us to think about. One of the things that I'm hoping the book does is provide people who understand that race matters and understand that racism exists, to provide to help those folks see race in a different way, that see race in a way that in terms uh, of it as a process, like I mentioned, because I think that a lot of the times race is talked about just as identity and then just about like racism, racist practice, but we're not talking about this process. And I'm hoping that the book really does provide readers with that type of like a something more than just the typical conversations that folks have about race. And I think that it's written in a way that's accessible to folks for with a lot of examples. Like I said, like it is in a schooling context, so some of us are very familiar with that type of context. So I'm hoping that the examples and the stories of the book really shows people how that's taking place right now.
Would you mind leaving us with one more example from the book, just so that, someone who's listening can, have a little bit better sense of this notion of racialization and how it happens in the classroom?
Sure. One of the ways that I mention in the book that is an implicit way is, for example, who was being honored in the classroom. So
Mm,
a lot of the times, the students who were getting the most direct attention from teachers, positive direct attention from teachers, were white students, and they were tracked into classrooms with more rigorous and with more um, practices with more instruction that researchers know lead to better outcomes. So
mm.
when we provide students with, for example, reading time for them to choose whichever book they want, then we know that they're going to be better readers than if we, for example, put them in classes where they're reading a paragraph and then we ask them multiple choice questions about that paragraph, which is where most of the Latinx students were tracked into. So then that leads to them having different outcomes, right? We would expect that. That's what research shows. When you provide students with better instruction, more rigorous instruction, they live up to that versus, for example, this multiple choice question. So then what that leads to then is that imagine now the auditorium of the school and all the students gathered in that auditorium to receive the honor roll, and then who's being called on the stage to get the highest honor roll, and it was white students, even though half of the program is Latinx students and half of the program is white students. So you see kind of the audience and then the difference in terms of what the stage is showing everyone.
So
And
that's such, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and the visual reinforces the idea that there are racial hierarchies and that they are something natural. These are the smart students, they get the honors, and that reinforces also then the outcomes in terms of the material prospects of the students once they leave school, right? Who's in the honor roll really makes a difference in terms of like your GPA and all that kind of stuff, then which universities you get into, which jobs, etc. So we know this, but just visually seeing that is reinforcing even implicitly that again there is this racialized group without us then questioning, well, this is so because they were given a different type of resource. These students had these better resources than these other students. It's not that these students were not capable of, for example, better work.
So I think that's such a nice example, and for me, just reflects what some scholars describe as the common sense of race or racial common sense, where you have these practices that, like you said, are predictably creating outcomes that make it look like that sort of entrench the naturalness of the groups and the hierarchy, the disparity, and it's a predictable process. And unless one is able to intervene and question, how it is operating, why things land the way they do, then it actually brings us back to a biological notion of race, in that there
Exactly.
are these fixed categories that lead to predictable outcomes, which also sort of helps us understand why the Trump administration is fixated on the idea that race is a social construct. And so if you see, for example, the attacks on the Smithsonian, one of the attacks is sort of predicated on this notion that it was divisive or problematic to articulate the notion that race is socially constructed. And as I was talking about with my students last week, the notion that race is socially constructed intervened against the idea that race was biological, which was an idea that was constructed in order to naturalize and justify far more sort of rigid and state-sponsored forms of, Jim Crow, apartheid, and slavery in the United States. And um, the Trump administration is systematically trying to purge the ideas, the words, and the concepts that we need to interrogate whether or not these disparities actually are natural, which the Trump administration would like us to think, or are the product of decisions that institutional actors are making that produce it. So, sorry, I went on too long. I'm clearly
No, I'm
um,
nodding vigorously for folks who are
um,
listening.
yeah, yeah. I'm just, I guess
Yes.
nerding out over the
We both are, yeah.
conversation. So I guess bef we'll wrap up in a moment. I'm going to ask you to plug again where folks can get the book, but any final, I don't know, thoughts for listeners, students, teachers who hopefully will read your book or just, want a sort of a place to land, given the conversation we've had.
Sure, thank you. So the book, How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America, is available at all major booksellers, Barnes& and Noble, Bookshop, the Harvard Ed Press. And like I mentioned before, I'd love for listeners to ask their public library or local bookstore to purchase the book. And final thoughts about it, I wrote it thinking of it being very readable and for people to be for it to be very accessible to folks. So I provide a lot of examples. I'm hoping that people see this as an example for them to know that gains, that we can together have different gains, but we have to make sure to always be vigilant and to make sure to work with others in order to progress our education and keep teaching about race and racialization and justice in order for us to be able to have a better future.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Laura Chavez-Moreno. It has been a pleasure chatting, and I will vouch that the book is really accessible. It's a really nice read that keeps you, wanting more, not just because I'm a nerdy guy who's trying to continue to learn more about this thing we call race. But with that, I'll thank you. I just want to, yeah, thank you again for joining us on the Race Class podcast, and I'm excited that folks will get to listen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.